This week on the Lectures in History podcast, Tulane University professor Keely Smith discusses Native American alliances during the Revolutionary War. She explores how the U.S. government and American society viewed various tribes during the early Republic. Professor Smith's research focuses on southeastern Native nations in the 18th and 19th century. Her book project, tentatively titled Communicating Sovereignty, A History of the Muskogee Language, 1715 to 1880, investigates the way in which the Muskogee language enabled the making and maintenance of Muskogee sovereignty in the southeast and the so-called Indian Territory from the 1750 Yamasee War through the late 19th century implementation of a written Muskogee language. More in a moment.
All right, good morning, everyone. Today I'm going to give a lecture on Native American powers, the problems of loyalty and liberty. So I'll start today's lecture with a painting by the Native American artist Fritz Scholder. The painting is called Bicentennial Indian, and it was created in 1975 to commemorate the American Revolution's 200th anniversary from a Native perspective. Scholder was one of 11 prominent American artists commissioned to create a work that answered the question, what does freedom mean to you? And so here we see a Native man dressed in traditional regalia. He's holding a quill. He's sitting on a European-style armchair, and he has an American flag draped across his lap. So I thought that I'd start by asking you all, what do you think this painting can tell us about what American freedom might mean to Native people? Guys? There you go. Yeah.
I think at the time of the bicentennial was at the time of the bicentennial, for Native Americans, being Native American could have been the combination of values of their ancestors as well as what colonial people brought to America.
Yeah, that's great. So it's perhaps showing this balancing act of Native people celebrating their cultures, but also being a part of this American story and a part of American history. That's great. Thank you. Does anyone else have any thoughts on the message that could be portrayed in this painting? Alex?
It's interesting to me that the subject of the painting is staring intently at the person who is creating the portrait. There's a solemn look on his face. He also seems to be at peace. So I'm wondering if the motives of the painting are suggesting that he has been absorbed into this American fabric. I'm curious about the expression on his face and what that evokes.
Yeah, that's a really great suggestion. Yes, it is. His facial expression is very somber, and we see this Native man in traditional regalia kind of protruding from what might be seen as a very European or Euro-American setting, where we've got this chair, which you might see that kind of furniture maybe in a setting with treaty negotiation, perhaps, and he's holding a quill, so maybe this could suggest the forced surrender of tribal lands. We also see the American flag is a little abstracted. You see the white line that's going between the blue background with the stars, so maybe that's showing that American freedom isn't as straightforward for Native people as it might be for other Americans. And also, there's a possibility that the American flag is a signal of patriotism as well. The American bicentennial was in 1976, which was right as the Vietnam War was ending, and a lot of Native American people were soldiers and fought in the Vietnam War. So perhaps it is a critique of American history and Native people's role in in the American past, but also perhaps it is a signal of Native people's position in this country and them demanding acknowledgement that they had a role in its history as well. So to me, this painting gets at many of the contradictions of Native American experiences of American freedom and American liberties. Native people were integrally involved in the war that made American freedom, and they continue to be an important part of this nation today. However, the promise of American liberty often rang hollow for Native people. The American freedom and liberties that white settlers experienced as a result of the American Revolution resulted in widespread dispossession of Native American land. And as the historian Kathleen Duval explained, as independence was gained for many white Americans, it was lost for many others, especially Native Americans. So today I'll discuss the roles and decisions of Native people during the Revolutionary War, their positions in wartime and post-war American propaganda, and the ways that the legacy of the American Revolution continues to affect Native nations to this day. So the typical story that you might hear about Native Americans in the American Revolution was that Native people picked the wrong side. They fought for the British lost, and then they were destined to move west and disappear. Or at least this is what the Patriots wanted you to believe. This story took root immediately following the Revolution. White Americans drew on racial distinctions between themselves as citizens and non-white people as others, and tapped into the revolutionary experience to justify dispossession by writing Native people out of the American story. And this practice of mythologizing Native people out of existence continued into the early Republic and to a certain extent to this day. Have you ever heard comments of either a certain Native nation or Native people in general dying out? Is that something that you guys have heard? Okay, I see some heads shaking. Right. So this is especially common in some places like New England, kind of think Last of the Mohicans, and it's common in our area in Louisiana as well. And this is where the myth of the vanishing Indian comes to play. The United States could justify taking Native land by using false claims like, oh, this Native nation supported the British, therefore they deserve to have their land taken away. Or, well, their communities are dying out anyway, so they won't need their land. When in reality, these communities that never disappeared were being forced off their land. The dispossession of Native people was not as inevitable as settlers from the past and present have claimed. It was not inevitable that the Patriots would win the war and that the US would expand across the continent. Native people had to juggle multiple possible outcomes of this conflict and make decisions that they believed would be best for their families and their communities. On the eve of the American Revolution, Native people dominated most of the territory that Britain claimed in North America. In some areas, colonial and Native communities were interdependent and lived in the same spaces or formed alliances. And then in other places, like west of the Mississippi River, Native nations remained powerful with very little contact with Euro-Americans. And because of this widespread power of Native nations on the continent, both the Patriots and the British understood Native alliances to be crucial in fighting this war. And both sides courted Native allies, or at least tried to talk them out of siding with the enemy. Native people had to make hard choices about how to intervene in this conflict, who to support, and whether to fight at all. And while making these decisions, Native people had to consider long-standing alliances with other Native nations and with European powers. And these choices mapped onto longer diplomatic histories, some of which the Patriots and the British were aware of, and some of which they were not. Native people also had to envision their own futures and discern which course of action would prove most effective. They had to grapple with existing political conditions in their own communities and consider lessons of the past, tribal politics of the present, and their goals for the future. Most Native communities hoped to remain neutral in the American Revolution. There had been a long history of holding back from totalizing alliances with any one European power and trying to play off empires by leveraging politics. And these tactics meant that Native nations could gain access to European trade goods, to wealth, and military alliances without sacrificing their individual sovereignties. And playing off European empires had been a winning strategy for sustaining Native autonomy. But when the Revolutionary War broke out, most Native people saw it as a conflict between white colonists and their mother country. And they really didn't want to be involved. So although at first a lot of nations believed that neutrality would be a viable option, over time the war exploded into a continent-wide struggle with theaters in Detroit and Pennsylvania and St. Louis and Kentucky, and which all of these locations were either next to Native communities or deep into Native homelands. And so over the course of the war, almost no Native nation to the east of the Mississippi managed to preserve total neutrality. The politics of wartime alliance became topics of debate that would have major repercussions for those fighting on both sides. So first, I'll share stories from the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois, in western New York and Pennsylvania, and from Lenape communities that had been forcibly removed to the Ohio Valley. And through Haudenosaunee and Lenape experiences, I'll discuss how Native choices to support the British or Patriots unfolded, how these alliances worked, and the repercussions of these alliances. And then we'll transition southward to discuss the final years of the war and its aftermath through the lens of Muskogee Creek, Choctaw, and the Petite nations of the Gulf South. Now I will say this map is not a perfect representation of the Native South. There are several nations that are not included in this map, but it'll serve our purposes for today. For many Native people in the Ohio Valley, Revolutionary-era alliances originated from tension surrounding settler expansion that had been a problem since the 7 Years' War that began in 1756. And so I'll take a moment to review what we discussed several weeks ago. When Great Britain beat the French in the 7 Years' War and gained French territorial claims in the Ohio River Valley, there was new fervor from British settlers to expand westward into these newly acquired Native homelands. However, the British feared that settler expansion would aggravate Native nations west of the Appalachians and lead to more war and therefore more debt. And the fear that the British might have to pay to protect settlers across this vast span of Native homelands inspired the British to establish the Proclamation Line of 1763, which did not allow settlers to move beyond the imaginary line along the Appalachian Mountains, right here. In response, the British, however, despite this proclamation line, this didn't stop settlers from crossing this imaginary line. They were still pushing their way into the Ohio Valley and the Kentucky country. And so, in response, the British signed the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in 1768 with headmen of the powerful Haudenosaunee Confederacy to move the original proclamation line westward into the Ohio Valley and Kentucky country. Now, this was a keen act of diplomacy by the Haudenosaunee, who mostly lived in western New York. The land they ceded were not the lands that they lived on. Rather, they were the principal hunting grounds of the Cherokee, Shawnee, and Lenape. The Treaty of Fort Stanwix then allowed the Haudenosaunee to protect their own territory in western New York by opening up other Native peoples' land to British settlement. But as you can imagine, that didn't make the Cherokee, Shawnee, or the Lenape very happy. And so this context from the early years of the imperial crisis influenced loyalties of these nations during the American Revolution about 10 years later. The Mohawks, one of the nations in the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, had long and close relationships with British officials since before the Treaty of Fort Stanwix and the 7 Years' War. Molly Brant, one of the most influential women in the Mohawk Nation and the widow of a British imperial officer, and her brother, Joseph Brant, convinced their nation and most of the Western tribes, but not all Haudenosaunee nations, to actively support the British. Many of these nations associated the Patriots with the American settlers who were stealing their land, and they hoped that the British would be able to counteract that expansion, and just like they had tried to do with the Proclamation Line of 1763. So do you remember how the Lenape were angry at the Haudenosaunee for surrendering their land in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix, like we just talked about? Yeah? Okay, so when the Revolutionary War broke out, the Lenape had this experience in mind. They tried to remain neutral at first, but as the war crept west, that neutrality became impossible. Both the British and Americans were trying to court the Lenape, and they were faced with a choice. Some Lenape did side with the British, but the British had allied with many of the Haudenosaunee nations who the Lenape still resented because of the Treaty of Fort Stanwix. The Lenape believed that the Haudenosaunee had betrayed them by ceding their hunting grounds, which meant that the Lenape didn't really want to cast their fate with the Haudenosaunee or the British. Therefore, most Lenape brokered an alliance with the United States and hoped that that alliance would secure important trade and diplomatic ties. To formalize this alliance, the Lenape signed the Treaty of Fort Pitt with the United States in 1778. Now, this was the first ever treaty signed between the United States and any native nation. And this treaty gave the United States permission to travel through Lenape territory and called on the Lenape to offer support to American troops against the British. And in exchange, the United States promised articles of clothing, utensils, and implements of war, and to build a fort in Lenape country that would supposedly protect Lenape towns. And the treaty recognized the Lenape as a sovereign nation and guaranteed their territorial rights. But what I think is the most fascinating thing about this treaty is that it encouraged other native nations in the Ohio Valley who also supported the United States to form a state headed by the Lenape that would have a representative in the Continental Congress. The treaty extended membership to any other tribes who have been friends to the interests of the United States to join the present Confederation and to form a state whereof the Delaware or Lenape nation shall be the head and have a representation in Congress. So let this sink in. While the different 13 states were writing their state constitutions like we talked about earlier this week and trying to figure out what it meant to be a state, the federal government was suggesting that Native people could be involved in this process with a state and congressional representation of their own. And this treaty was important because it disrupts the narrative that settler colonialism was an inevitable force and that a union of diverse polities was impossible. U.S. policymakers put on paper the possibility of political union with indigenous nations. And as I'll discuss in a few minutes, they deliberately rejected this vision after the war. Forming alliances with Euro-Americans during the American Revolution proved to be a lose-lose game for nearly all Native people. After a series of Haudenosaunee and British raids against settlers in New York and Pennsylvania, George Washington, who we know was the head of the Continental Army, decided that he needed to retaliate for these raids and do something so severe that it would break the alliance between the Haudenosaunee and the British. So he decided to target Haudenosaunee civilians and use the scorched earth method to destroy Haudenosaunee towns in what became known as Sullivan's campaign. The goal of the campaign was total destruction. Some have even called it genocide. Washington aimed to capture as many people as possible. Destruction and terror, Washington claimed, were essential to future security for Americans in the region. And although many Haudenosaunee successfully ran to the British before being captured, Patriots burned about a year's worth of ripening corn in the fields, in addition to Haudenosaunee homes and orchards and other crops. And many of the soldiers in the Continental Army were also farmers, and they knew just how long it took to plant a year's worth of crops. And so there's a lot of journals and diaries where Continental soldiers show a lot of unease about the destruction that they committed in these Haudenosaunee towns that was directed by George Washington. And so in 1790, a Seneca chief from the Haudenosaunee Confederacy named Corn Planter told Washington, "When your army entered the country of the Six Nations, we called you town destroyer. And to this day, when your name is heard, our women look behind them and turn pale, and our children cling close to the necks of their mothers."
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
Although Americans are often taught to view George Washington as a heroic figure today, Native people's experiences during the American Revolution gave them a very different perspective on this nation's first president. Haudenosaunee nations would return to their respective homelands after Sullivan's campaign, but their evacuation in 1779 allowed white Americans to imagine further Native disappearance. Sullivan's campaign was a rehearsal for a longer campaign of Haudenosaunee dispossession that followed in the years after the war. And Haudenosaunee people still remember this event with immense outrage and sadness. I saw this work of art in a museum several years ago, and it projects imagery related to Sullivan's campaign onto a bust of George Washington. Alan Michelson, a Mohawk artist, created it in 2018. And unfortunately, I don't have a video, but over the span of several minutes, scenes reflected on Washington transition from colonial maps of Haudenosaunee homelands, like you see here, to language on historical markers commemorating the destruction, to bloodshed, to broken treaties, and finally to a wampum belt that the Haudenosaunee used to keep records for diplomatic history and relationships. Ending with the wampum belt after the colonial maps and bloodshed represented indigenous sovereignty and survival as the bust of Washington literally fades into the background. With this artwork, Michelson created a new narrative for the Sullivan campaign that represented the injustice and hardship that the Haudenosaunee face, but ended with Native power. And it makes a strong statement that Native people didn't disappear as settlers predicted. Instead, Washington is the one to fade into the darkness. The Lenape, who formed an alliance with the Americans, didn't fare much better than the Haudenosaunee, who had supported the British. The Lenape-American alliance, established by the Treaty of Fort Pitt, didn't last for very long. Within about a year of signing, the Lenape were expressing grievances about the treaty. Moreover, patriots claimed that White Eyes, the Lenape's most outspoken American ally, had allegedly died of smallpox. However, White Eyes had already had smallpox in the past. And as we learned from Pax Americana this week, you can't have smallpox twice. So therefore, the Lenape believed that American militiamen, who they had supposedly been allied with, had killed White Eyes and tried to cover it up using the smallpox story. A Lenape delegation visited Philadelphia in 1779 to explain its dissatisfaction to the Continental Congress, but nothing changed, so peaceful relationships between the Lenape and the United States collapsed. And not long afterward, many Lenape communities joined the British in the war against their former allies. Any remaining goodwill between patriots and the Lenape was destroyed during the Janaida Hutton massacre in 1782. Patriots inspired by anti-Indian racism slaughtered a community of pacifists, Moravian Mohicans in Lenape and present-day Ohio. And the pacifism of these native Christians made both the British and Patriots suspicious. That, on top of frontier combat dating back to the 7 Years' War, to British-sponsored raids, to unreliable native alliances, led white Pennsylvanians to believe that native people could never be true allies, and therefore they were eligible for extermination. As the Moravians were collecting crops in March of 1782, the Pennsylvania militia falsely promised the Moravians that they would be relocated away from the warring parties. But once they were gathered together, the American militia rounded up the unarmed Moravian native people and told them that they would be executed for being spies, which was a completely false claim. There's no evidence that these individuals were spies. The pacifist Mohican and Lenape Moravians didn't put up a fight because they were pacifists, but they did ask their captors to allow them to pray and worship the night before their execution. And so they spent the evening in prayer and singing Christian hymns and psalms. And then the next morning, Patriots raped many of the native women and girls and then murdered nearly everyone there, including 28 men, 29 women, and 39 children. Even the native people who adopted Euro-American religion and ways of life were not safe from anti-Indian racism and violence. And although the Moravians' patriot killers were not punished for their murders, future Americans such as Theodore Roosevelt would remember the injustice of this event, calling it a stain on the frontier character that the lapse of time cannot wash away. And so when Americans think of this nation's founding, they often think of freedom and liberty and not repeated massacres of native people. And while it's not wrong to associate the revolution with liberty and freedom, we need to think of these stories too. The nation was forged in violent campaigns to dispossess Native Americans and purge non-white people of lands that patriots had no just claim to. And the Lenape, just like the Haudenosaunee, did not forget the hardships that they faced during the American Revolution. In 1910, one of the Lenape nations who had been forcibly removed to Oklahoma sent a petition to Congress that requested compensation for their nation's Revolutionary War service as soldiers and former allies to the United States. And the petition reminded Congress that the Lenape had been the first to assist in their struggle for independence, and that they gave white patriots free access to their territory, agreed to forts on their property, and received nothing but smallpox in return. And this petition flies in the face of the typical story that Native people were doomed to disappear. The petition shows us that Native people were on both sides of the war, that they survived the conflict, and that they're still around as functional nations speaking together as one voice, claiming a significant role in the American past and demanding to be acknowledged. They reminded Congress that independence had only been won with their help, and they deserve to be recognized as co-creators of American liberty. So thus far, we've discussed the problems of loyalties in the American Revolution for Native people in New York, Pennsylvania, and the Ohio Valley, and the ways that Native politics informed decisions about alliances. Now we'll move southward and discuss the effects of the war for Native nations closer to our region here in New Orleans. But before I continue, does anyone have any questions? Oh, okay. Then I'll keep going. So much like in the North, many Native nations in the South had tried to remain neutral in the Revolutionary War, but were eventually forced to take sides. Individual towns in large Native nations, such as the Muskogee Creek, Cherokee, and Choctaw, made different decisions about who they would support in the war. Most supported the British because they believed that Britain could offer better access to trade goods, but they also associated land-hungry settlers with the Patriot cause. However, if you look at individual cases, the loyalties of Native towns often had more to do with who Native townspeople had economic or kinship ties with. Many southeastern traders became patriots and sometimes convinced their respective trading towns to support the American cause. However, Georgia was also the home to many loyalists, some of which joined native towns to avoid patriot mistreatment. Loyalist presence in native towns and their marrying into native families sometimes contributed to native support for the British as well. And this was the case for Alexander McGillivray, one of the most influential leaders in Muskogee Creek history. McGillivray's father was a loyalist deerskin trader, and his mother was from the powerful Muskogee Wind Clan. And so when patriots seized McGillivray's father's belongings in Georgia, his father left for Scotland, and Alexander moved back to the Muskogee Creek Nation, where he fought on the side of the British. Unfortunately, there's no known images of McGillivray, but here's a letter that he wrote that I found in an archive. Native revolutionary loyalties depended on individual town decisions, but regardless of the town or nation, it was common for large native polities to demonstrate their power and capacity for force through intimidation. As an example, Choctaws near Spanish Louisiana and Muskogee Creeks near the Georgia border would slaughter cattle, demand food, and play stickball to intimidate settlers and remind them of their people's capacity to enact real violence. Native Southerners referred to stickball as the younger brother of war, and they took this often violent game very seriously. As players would chase each other up and down the fields, they demonstrated the military capabilities of their respective nations. And these strategic displays of force allowed Native nations to remind Euro-Americans that they were not going to be ignored, but also allowed them to avoid intervening too directly in conflicts with Europeans. Although the British had the support of many Muskogee Creek and Choctaw towns, in reality, the British did not receive that much military support from these Native nations, considering their large population. They did get some Native support, and like the Choctaws supported the British by patrolling the Mississippi River for a period of time. But in reality, like I said, because of, or in comparison to these populations, these were enormous nations of Native people. There were way more Native people in the South than there were colonists. So comparatively, the British didn't actually receive that much help, and neither did the Patriots. And part of this had to do with the fact that Muskogee Creeks faced a harsh bout of smallpox during the late stages of the war, exactly when the British needed them most. But more importantly, many Native men didn't want to leave their families vulnerable to Patriot attacks to go fight in a white man's war. And so, although the British lost the Revolutionary War, in many ways, Native Southerners' lives stayed the same. They didn't lose their ability to play off empires. Spain regained control of Florida after the war, and Native nations such as the Choctaws and Muskogee Creeks made efforts to build trade relationships with both the Americans and the Spanish. And Alexander McGillivray, the Muskogee Creek leader who I mentioned just a few minutes ago, was particularly adept at forming alliances with both polities. And the Spanish were successful in building these relationships because they welcomed the Scottish-owned deerskin trading firm Panton, Leslie and Company to continue in its trade monopoly with Native Southerners in now Spanish Florida. And this satisfied many Native Southerners who were already familiar with British and Scottish trade goods and traders. And so, even though imperial maps looked quite different after the Revolutionary War, Native imperial strategies, as well as British goods and intermediaries, remained a part of Native Southerners' lives for several more decades. Americans might have won the war, but Spanish and British interference persisted. Now, Native Southerners might not have lost their imperial trade partners, but they did lose a lot of land after the American Revolution. Following the war, the United States didn't recognize any of the loyalties that Native people offered the Patriots. A Congressional Committee on Indian Affairs claimed in 1784 that Native people were, quote, themselves aggressors in the war, without even a pretense of provocation. So therefore, Native land was simply reasonable compensation for the expenses and alarms to which they have exposed their unoffending neighbors, the United States. So this rewriting of history was propaganda that justified ongoing dispossession through the early republic. And in 1786, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Cherokees signed the Treaty of Hopewell with the United States that forced these southeastern nations to cede significant portions of their southeastern territories. But it promised to enable trade with the United States and to protect these nations from squatters and invading settlers. Now, this recognition of Native sovereignty would be undermined over and over again in the next several generations, and Native dispossession would continue. However, the fact that these large Native nations engaged in treaty negotiations resulted in a formal relationship between the United States and these Native nations, which would be important for federal Indian law in the future and to this day. In contrast, smaller Native nations like the Petite nations in Louisiana and the Gulf South often did not engage in treaty agreements with the United States. Now, this was partially by choice. There were benefits to flying under the radar of U.S. officials. But it was also because the United States considered these nations too small to be worth negotiating with. United States officials conveniently claimed that these nations were so small that they would eventually die out, which brings us back to the vanishing Indian trope. And this was basically another convenient way of justifying taking these Native nations' land. And the fact that these petite nations did not have formal alliances with the United States government meant that they had to devise their own strategies to deal with the onslaught of settlers streaming into their homelands after the American Revolution. Some joined the larger and more powerful Choctaws, and others migrated to new lands and formed new multinational communities to avoid settler violence. But not establishing formal agreements with the United States in the 18th century influenced the position of these Native nations in the 19th century and to this day. Although some of these nations, such as the Tunica Biloxi and several others, have gone through lengthy processes of applying for and receiving federal recognition over the past 50 years or so, many nations are still not recognized by the federal government and therefore lack financial support and federal protection that other federally recognized nations have today. Even though the American Revolution divided many Native nations, it led to greater unity between them. Later in the war, continued incursions of patriots led Native people not just to seek British alliances, but to establish tribal unity against widespread settler encroachment. Native nations began to unite in their own confederacies against the United States, and these pan-tribal, anti-American alliances continued long after Britain and her former colonies made peace. And although these efforts at intertribal unity sparked outrage from white Americans, the lessons these nations learned to unite with one another have followed them to this day. We saw this during the Red Power movement in the 1960s and 1970s, when Native nations across the United States united to assert Native sovereignty and reclaim ancestral land. And these efforts were an important part of the bicentennial commemorations of 1976, which takes us back to the bicentennial Indian painting. Acts of indigenous unity continue today as nations reflect on their past and fight for their sovereignty and environmental rights. And this movement has even expanded globally. Indigenous nations from across the world are collaborating to advance the rights of indigenous peoples to self-determination, land, and life. So, to conclude, when we think of the American Revolution today, many often think of no taxation without representation, or the boycott of British goods, or Washington valiantly crossing the Delaware. Native people are often not included in these stories, but as we've seen today, Native people were integral to the American Revolution.
C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast continues in a moment. Now back to C-SPAN's Lectures in History podcast.
The British and Americans battled for Native support, but in reality, Native loyalties had more to do with intertribal politics, personal relationships with Euro-Americans, and efforts to protect their communities for the future. And ultimately, revolutionary loyalties for Native people were a lose-lose situation. Those who sided with the British faced brutal attacks by the Patriots and loss of land after the war, but those who supported the Patriots also experienced this. Patriots during and after the war used the myth that Native people supported the British to justify violence and widespread dispossession of Native land. And despite the often heart-wrenching circumstances that Native people faced during and after the war, many of these nations refused to be written out of American history. They collaborated with other Native nations, established more international alliances, and have continued to assert sovereignty to the present day. And so, as we enter into the American Revolution's 250th anniversary next year, we'll have the opportunity to see how Native people position themselves in this nation's past, present, and future, just as Native people have done since the nation's founding. Does anyone have any questions? Bethany? Oh, do we want to bring the... Yeah, there we go.
I was just going to ask for the state of Mississippi, who had like ownership of it, because we saw with like Louisiana that it was the French. So was Mississippi still in control by the American colonies?
So I believe that Spain probably claimed control over a lot of Mississippi. However, the reality of who had control in this space would have been mostly the Choctaws and some of the Petite nations and several other Native nations. So, you know, that's kind of a common question among historians of, you know, the question of which map is really correct. We'll see maps showing imperial claims versus the reality of who had power on the ground. And in many cases, it was different Native powers. So that's a great question, though. Thank you. Does anyone else have any questions? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you, you guys. Hope you have a great afternoon.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Book Notes Plus podcast, you can find all the episodes wherever you get your podcasts. Lectures in History will be back next week.